A warm welcome to you. I'm very pleased to once again have the opportunity to share with you some aspects of my work as an architectural photographer, because in many ways the disciplines of photographic and modeled and visualized architectural representation overlap. As part of Enscape's Envision 21 last year, I gave a talk in which I addressed some issues. The gratifying response has prompted us to think further about the four topics I addressed and to explore them in greater depth. I cordially invite you to do so. Rendering is like photography, applying the principles of architectural photography to your renderings. Part 2 of 4, the photographer's camera and lenses, technically created stylistic elements. My name is Aryan Mirfendereski and I'm an architect. During my work as a research assistant and lecturer at the chair of computer-aided architectural design and the chair of building technology, the focus of my activities was on the one hand on individual research projects and on the other hand on the conception and implementation of teaching formats in the diploma, bachelor's and master's degree programs. My teaching included raising awareness of team understanding and the formation of team structures, drawing in 2- and 3-dimensional space, the visualization of the same, and photographic and cinematic representation using digital techniques. Over time, I've defined architectural representation as the focal point of my part-time work as a photographer. After a fulfilling period of study and subsequent research and teaching, I decided to devote myself to photography full-time with a focus on architectural documentation, whereby I keep an eye on the entire process, from the planners, the design, and the construction documentation to the finished object and its use. In this session, I would like to make you aware of aspects of photography that you can use to enhance the quality of your architectural visualizations, because one thing is quite clear: rendering is like photography. Just because my ingredients are all organic and I use professional pots and pans for cooking and frying does not mean that my food tastes good. Having does not mean knowing. Knowing is a comprehensive knowledge and consideration. To be able to convey the complexity of my thoughts when designing and of my perception when photographing, it takes more than pure technology. Technology has always been and still is only a tool. How I use it, for what and to what extent, is just as decisive for the visualizer as it is for the photographer, as it is for the chef, as anyone else who wants to get the best out of their product with their technology. So let's not necessarily talk about the technology, but rather about the power of the thoughts that you put into a project and the means you have at your disposal to communicate those thoughts. Let's talk about the visual language, about the readability of a picture, about the aesthetic effects and its laws, about stylistic means, which you in turn can use with the help of your technology to let the viewers of your work actually see what you want them to see. The first webinar on the topic of image creation, entitled The Eye of the Photographer, can be found, should you be interested, on the Enscape website and on YouTube. The following webinars are the photographer's camera and lenses, technically created stylistic elements, opponents and allies, opponents can be allies, and the fourth part will be an Enscape case study. So let's get started with the second of 4 sessions, the photographer's camera and lenses. Let's talk about the technical aspects of the equipment and how the essential workings of the camera and lenses can help the photographer translate the themes of the first webinar in terms of story, emotion, and atmosphere when creating a scene. I would like to make one important point in advance. As experienced Enscape 3D users, you know, of course, that the following topics of this webinar, such as the focal length, the exposure time, and the aperture, are technical but also optical topics, which are dealt with differently in Enscape 3D. In the first webinar, we talked about photography and image creation and discussed how to deal with the content and readability of an image. In this webinar, we will talk about the technical aspects that make the mentioned above possible. The transfer to Enscape 3D will be done in the fourth webinar, the case study. We start with the focal length: shorten, lengthen, compress, and distort. There are, of course, focal lengths that are not particularly suitable for everyday photography. In this case, we are talking about a fisheye, which with its 10.5 millimeters bends the entire world. As far as architectural representation is concerned, there are certainly one or two special cases for which such a focal length has its reason for being. The wide angle, the millimeter, should not necessarily play a role here, enables us to tell a scene in its depth and with its distances. Individual elements of the motif are shown in depth. Perspective alignments can be read. Whereas a long focal length creates a very compressed, even graphic image in perspective, one says very casually that one zooms in, but that is by no means correct. It's much more. You zoom into a scene and at the same time you draw the distant towards you. In the area of the motif, you compress the near and the far, and so you flatten the surroundings. And in this case, what remains is a strict, distanceless staccato of the vertical lines. One should always be aware of this when telling a story. Even in shots taken from a bird's eye or skyscraper view, from which distances can be read so clearly, with a long focal length, the distances disappear and the buildings seem to, excuse me, to be lined up in a collage. Only the road winding through the buildings suggests a distance in perspective. So let me tell you about the development and the processing of distances with the help of the Paw Patrol. For the following shots, I successively moved away from the table and at the same time increased the focal length. The actual distance to the table should not play a role here because in real life you don't often photograph plastic dogs that your children haven't put away. The distance therefore depends among other things on the size of your subject. With a focal length of 14 millimeter, you see the dogs positioned quite randomly and with large distances in depth from each other. Now let's see what happens when we zoom and compress. Focal length 24 millimeter, 50 millimeter, 80, 100, 140, 200, and 300. Everest, Rubble, Chase, Sky, Rocky, and Marshall stand almost in a line. There is no longer even a readable distance to the background. For comparison, I did not move the dogs. It becomes clear why the wide angle is the most common focal length for architectural representation when it comes to telling the story of larger structures from more or less medium distance. And the long focal length is more advantageous for producing graphic representations. What you should be aware of is that with very small focal lengths, optical distortion can occur at the edges of the image. This may not be immediately obvious in this example. But if there are objects at the edges of the picture, such as chairs, which we know well from our everyday life and whose size and shape are familiar to our brain, we notice very quickly that distortions occur here. Very faintly Elements at the edges of the pictures begin to warp here. The chair in the lower left corner seems to have a particularly wide backrest, and the lamps and the skylight no longer appear circular but elliptical. However, it becomes quite clear here, apart from the fact that the skylights warp considerably, the ceiling and the floor seem very stretched so that the depth of the room increases unusually. On the one hand, you can use a low focal length to make rooms appear larger than they really are. On the other hand, you must not exceed a certain degree of believability, and also pay attention to the correct graphic representation of individual image components. Believability. But what should be considered with objects that are in the center of the picture? For this staircase, I chose a medium focal length and sufficient distance. The result is a staircase situation that is balanced in its proportions and correctly narrated. In comparison, I had not enough space to the rear in this case, and thus also had to choose a wide-angle lens. Nevertheless, I like the result. My customer likes it too. Graphically, it is balanced and the photo works. But the distortion cannot be dismissed out of hand. However, do not see the distortion at the edges of the image when using the more extreme wide angles as a weakness of the technology, but rather as a possibility of the optics. Tilting the camera up or down, as in this case, allows you to distort objects so that they appear more dominant in the picture. This does this photo a lot of good. We have already talked about Henning Larsen's design for the tower in Sydney as part of the first webinar. Looking at this now, with regard to the choice of focal length, one quickly realizes that the choice of the visualizers at Luxigon should not have been different. Here, the space is reproduced in all its qualities in terms of height and width. Architect, 3D artist and instructor Adeoluwa Oba-Adenuga shows this beautiful visualization with medium focal length on behance.net. He has made sure that there are no prominent objects at the edges of the image so that the viewer's concentration is fully on the relatively flat central representation, and yet the perspective development can still be read in the alignment. His choice of portrait format for this night shot shows that subjects that develop in width are usually bestowed in width. I've chosen this image from many very beautiful visualizations by the artist merely to illustrate the effect in both formats. Take a look at his work when you get a chance. Luxigon for Kengo Kuma's Aquatic Center in Copenhagen. It's not just about the building, but about the scenery, the building and its surroundings, and the surroundings with this building. So to briefly summarize what we saw in the first subtopic of this webinar, both open and enclosed spaces with imaging components in their effect in terms of distances between them and the camera, them among themselves, and also them and the foreground and background. We looked at how these distances change with the choice of focal length and what we should consider in our choice in terms of our storytelling. When using long focal lengths, such as a telephoto zoom in this case, it quickly becomes clear that in addition to compression and elongation, other stylistic devices become apparent. The bouquet, the transition from sharpness to blurriness in the distance. So let's talk about the aperture, depth of field. In more or less classic portrait shots, we are familiar with the bouquet in the background. It is caused by turning down the f number of your lens, that means opening up the aperture and thus letting in more light in the same exposure time, which in turn falls on our sensor or film. In this example, the focus on the actress and the focus is on the actress, and the bookshelf 2 meters away is already quite blurred. For architectural shots, especially outdoor shots, you usually use a fairly closed aperture, which in turn, in combination with a wider focal length, ensures a slower progression of sharpness towards blur. But if I change the distance between the camera and the motive, I have the possibility to control the process of sharpness with the help of the aperture. Here, several factors are important and even dependent on each other. The distance between the camera and the subject, the ratio of the distances from the camera to the motive, and from the motive to the background, and from the motive to the foreground, and the focal length. For this picture, rubble again. I closed the aperture of my lens as much as possible. The f number is set to 22. All other settings should not interest us for the time being. In the course of the following photos, I will gradually open the aperture, thus increasing the opening, which in turn means that I will reduce the f number to let more light into my camera. So f number 22. F number 20, 18, 16, 14, 13, 12, 10, 9, 8, F number 7.1, 6.3, 5.6, 5, 4.5, 4, 3.5, 3.2, 2.8. You can always find out why the full and the third f stops are sometimes crooked values in simple articles online. Don't be angry with me if I don't communicate any technical derivations in this webinar. Please take a look at Rubble, the yellow dressed dog, on whom the focus sits. Now look at the dog or the dogs in the second row, and then a look at the picture frame in the background. And now for comparison to the open aperture, the shot with the aperture closed with the f number 22. Just as we choose a relatively closed f number of around 9 or 10 or 11 for wide angles outdoor and indoor shots to extend the progression of sharpness, what means to keep as much as possible in focus in front of and behind the focal point. This changes when we move closer to the main motive and even lengthen the focal length a little. In this case, the f number remained unchanged. Nevertheless, the dependencies in the distances show a clear decrease in sharpness in the distance. And with a zoomed focus on a nearby motive and opening the aperture, it quickly becomes clear how focal length, aperture, and distances depend on each other. Such a way of working is very advantageous for interior shots, as it allows you to determine the main focus very specifically and through the course of the sharpness to simulate more or less our way of perception. Our human field of vision also encompasses much more than we actually focused by our eyes and brain. The rest is blurred, registered. At this point, I show another quick example of the same restaurant, showing the restaurant without showing the restaurant. I have only tried to capture the view with the Cologne Cathedral, which is so important to the people of Cologne, but not to forego the cozy atmosphere at the table. So what is important is to make sure that the aperture you choose in combination with the focal length and the distance is such that the objects are still sharp enough in their progression to serve your narrative. This applies to the same extent to individual objects and furnishings in the interior. In this picture, I focused on the front headlight, which is on the left as seen from us. Depending on the aperture, the sharpness then decreases more or less rapidly towards the front and towards the back. I had to be careful not to blur the rear of the car so much that it would be perceived as distracting. For architectural shots, one would have considered placing the focus, if possible, on the center of the subject. That means on the wing doors of the car. In this case, the focus would move evenly, fast or slow, to the front and back of the entire vehicle, would be sharp at a well-chosen aperture. However, since this is a product photo, I wanted to have the absolute sharpness on the front of the car in this case. By opening the aperture, we visually expose the objects in focus. The degree of optical exposure is what we decide by setting the aperture after determining the distances and the focal length. A very relevant topic in model photography. You want to depict large objects in a small scale. Here you cannot avoid dealing with the aperture. I would like to show you this work called Dune by Stanislav Ananev. In this context, I also found it on behance.net. The artist is not only very careful with materials and skillful with perspectives, compositions, and image cropping, but he also narrates the project very beautifully with increasing focal length and thereby increasing aperture. Here just a small selection of this project, which has been very extensively illustrated. A small, short digression on a topic that should be familiar to all of you visually, but not from a technical point of view, perhaps. The light source of the front lantern is represented as a light sphere. With the closing of the aperture, you create more and more of a star at this point. The number of light rays from each light source in an image depends on the number of aperture segments of your lens. Finally, let us return at this point to work by Wong Swong, which I found on Facebook in the Enscape official community group and already shown in the context of the first webinar to summarize the points mentioned in this sub-theme. With a very deliberately and convincingly chosen distance to the main motif, a tree, the artist manages here with a closed aperture to make the tree absolutely sharp and yet to let the focus move backwards because there is no foreground worth mentioning, so slowly that even the distant edges of the room and the furniture are sharply delineated. As a further indication of the closed aperture, there is the light source, the sun, which does not appear as a ball of light, but has the classic rays of the sun. Last but not least, the fact that the sunlight falls as a visible ray exactly on the main motif, the tree, shows that the artist here knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. Talking about defining light, so let's talk about the shutter speed. Define light, imply movement. If, on the one hand, you lengthen the exposure time in order to draw with the traces of the car's lights, as in this example, then it is clear that you run the risk of overexposing the image even in low ambient light. So you have to regulate the light elsewhere. One possibility, as you can see here, is to reduce the aperture. I gladly accepted the resulting star-shaped light sources as a kitschy element. So there is another dependency, namely that between the aperture size and the exposure time. The simplest reason for a long exposure is the lack of ambient light. In this case, I had to do a manual exposure of 5 or 6 minutes because the skyline lights were largely off late at night. Implying movement with the exposure always has something to do with try and error until you find the necessary exposure time. Since I have already mentioned the dependencies between the focal length and the aperture and the exposure time, let us always keep in mind when looking at the following picture that you have to counteract the more light via the exposure time on the other side with the size of the aperture if you are to succeed in taking an evenly exposed shot. Flowing in and out of the pavilion with a slightly longer exposure time, and of course the help of a tripod, one can easily show these directions of movement. However, the exposure time was not short enough to freeze the faintly moving staff member of the pavilion in the center of the picture. Quite a short exposure time, short enough to bring people, even those in motion, to a standstill, but not short enough to freeze the pigeons. There is still a hint of movement in them. I'm sure that the schoolyard atmosphere that I think is needed here would not have been achieved and communicated with a shorter exposure time and thus children frozen in their movement. The tension and dramaturgy of this image is mainly carried by the exact exposure time. For this shot, I managed to choose the exposure time very appropriately. It describes very well who is not moving in this scene, moving very little and moving very fast. And while I was very concentrated on setting the kiss of both pavilions in perspective, the boy stopped in front of me and watched me. Unprepared and surprised, I snapped a quick picture. A slight blur of movement stands out in the boy. The exposure time was not set long for this. Was set too long for this particular scene. And for this picture, I set the exposure time so long that the car I wanted to capture drove completely through my frame. The car itself was no longer shown in the photo, but fortunately the rear lights were. It's a mistake that I now very much welcome. Choosing exposure time so short that even fast movements of cyclists are frozen is of course also a possibility, as long as there is enough light that you can choose the exposure time and the aperture as needed. The same in this example. And the same in this visualized example by Archicad, which you may still know from the first webinar. Here, the people and the vehicles are rendered directly and not included in the post-processing. This naturally creates snapshots without any movement. If you search online for outstanding visualizations, you will of course find countless visualizations by exceptionally gifted artists. I've chosen this one to show you because this one is a kind of the final boss images. St. Regent in London, modeled and visualized by Stanislav Lukianchuk and Konstantin Fonat. You can find the work on behance.net or on mirrorstudio.com, 2x Mirror Studio. If you're interested in visualizations, visit this website. Here, not a building was visualized, but a cinematic scene. Part of this scene is also one of several buildings, which is in the main focus. One could go through all the individual topics of the first and the second webinar on this image, but that is not our aim here. Here, only one sentence should be said regarding the exposure time. When I saw this picture, I reflexively pulled my head in so I wouldn't get wet. Last but not least, ISO, the light sensitivity of my sensor. Those of you who have ever bought film for an analog camera know that the light sensitivity of the film was always measured in or specified in ISO or ASA. At least these are the most common measuring methods. With the digital systems, this still applies. The sensitivity of the sensor and thus the responsiveness to the incidence of light can be set manually or automatically selected by the camera. Don't worry, I will not burden you here with technical tables or laboratory values. If you're interested, you have all the sources in the world at your disposal online. Let's just look at what happens to an image and its details, especially in darker areas, when the light sensitivity of the sensor is turned up successively. This one was shot with ISO 200. 400, ISO 800, 1600, 3200, I just skipped some steps, 6400, ISO 10,000, 16,000, and ISO 25,600. For comparison, just as everything that has to do with sensitivity will reach its tolerable limits at some point, the same applies to the ISO value and the resulting photos. The less ambient light there is, the more carefully you should handle the light sensitivity of your sensor. Otherwise, your pictures will lose detail and show more or less ISO noise. But now that we have become acquainted with the new factor, which apparently also plays a role in the dependencies of light, we can talk about these factors once and for all. The dependence of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO by pctip.ch. Let's keep it simple here too, because practice makes perfect. The more light you allow yourself via the exposure time, the more you have to save via the size of the aperture opening in order to produce a balanced image. That is simple. It only becomes more difficult when you set yourself parameters to achieve a certain look. 2 examples. For the first, let's assume that your exposure time must be half a second as you wish, so that the light streaks of the passing cars are exactly as long as you want them to be. Then you have to keep the aperture quite small. If you do not mind aperture stars on the light sources in the picture, you have quite a lot of room to play with closing the aperture. If, however, your surroundings are not supposed to be too dark, a lot of light will fall on your sensor with a long exposure time, and you will not be able to close the aperture far enough. In this case, you can also reduce the ISO value, if there is still room for adjustment. If not, you will not be able to maintain the exposure time of half a second. You have to shoot faster or wait until it gets darker. Second example. You are standing quite close to 2 athletes competing against each other and need to keep a very fast shutter speed to capture the athletes in motion sharply. Because of the fast shutter speed, you lack light, which you now want to capture by opening your aperture. However, you realize that the aperture or the open aperture you need, on the other hand, ensures that your sharpness decreases too rapidly, and one of the athletes is always out of focus. You remember you are standing quite close, and in this case, the sharpness may also fall off more quickly. Now, you should always keep the ISO value, the light sensitivity, as low as possible, but if you urgently need light, there is also a smaller or larger margin here, depending on the amount of ambient light. That's it. I've talked so much about photography that I've become really hungry. The weather is miserable here, but perfect to go out with the camera. So what's next? I'm looking forward to that. Opponents and allies. Opponents can be allies. The light, the one and only, the most important in all its facets. Against all trades, we have not laid the floor. Can you fix it in Photoshop? Architectural Digest. Your furniture is wonderful. May I move it away for the photos? And the post-production. Bring things to the point, because nobody eats his good piece of meat raw, except for some special or even cultural influenced specialties, of course, but you certainly know what I mean. And last but not least, an Enscape case study, step by step from model to visualization. So stay excited. If you have any questions about the content of this part, please send me an email to the address shown until the 16th of February. I would answer our questions at the beginning of the third session. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your precious time, and I wish you all the best.